In the summer of 2014, it seemed that things were looking up for Daniel Markel, a 41-year-old Canadian-born attorney and law professor. He was incredibly accomplished academically, having earned both his undergraduate degree and Juris Doctor, or JD, from Harvard University, which led to a successful career as a law clerk to Judge Michael Daley Hawkins of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and then as an associate for a prestigious Washington, D.C. law firm. 9 years earlier, in 2005, he had joined the faculty of Florida State University's College of Law, where he earned tenure in 2010. Most of Markel's work focused on the intersection between crime, punishment, and family, and in 2009, he had collaborated with some of his colleagues on a book titled Privilege or Punish: Criminal Justice and the Challenge of Family Ties, which examined how family ties are both privileged and penalized within the justice system, highlighting inconsistencies and conflicts with egalitarian principles. The work further argues that while family-based considerations may be appropriate, many current practices are problematic and warrant reform. Additionally, he co-authored a blog for law professors titled Prof's Blog and a number of articles in prestigious law journals. Dan Markel had an interest in sports law and wrote op-ed pieces for the New York Times, Slate, and The Atlantic. He also consulted for the defense in a federal prosecution in New Jersey involving rabbis accused of extortion by the FBI. Dan Markel appeared to be successful and very well liked by his colleagues and students alike. Yet on July 18, 2014, just after 11 a.m., Dan Markel was shot at his Tallahassee, Florida home, and he succumbed to his injuries the following day while in the hospital. When Tallahassee Police Department arrived at the scene and began their investigation, they determined that Markel was indeed the victim of an attack and classified the case as a homicide. No one could quite understand how this relatively beloved man could be targeted for such a heinous crime, as tributes from his academic colleagues poured in ahead of a memorial service in his honor.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement.
The case that unfolded in the wake of Dan Markel's death is one that is far more complicated and sensational than the city of Tallahassee, Florida expected. Over the course of the next 10 years, lengthy investigations would be made by both Tallahassee law enforcement and the FBI, with wiretaps, recorded conversations, and 4 murder trials for a murder wrapped up in a family conspiracy. Even today, the case is not considered completely closed, as a 5th defendant in the case, Wendi Adelson, is expected to begin trial in the coming days. That is, in August of 2025, if you're listening to this episode as it's being released. So on today's episode of Law and Disorder, we are going to discuss what turned out to be a murder for plot hire against Dan Markel. We're going to discuss the 10-plus year struggle for justice in this case and talk about the most recent developments that are set to take place in a courtroom in Tallahassee in the very near future. Here's what happened on the day of the murder. On the morning of July 18, 2014, Dan Markel left his home with his 2 sons to drop them off at daycare. Drop-off happened just before 9 a.m. After he dropped off the boys, he headed to the gym, which was Premier Health and Fitness Center on Maclay Boulevard, and a silver pine Toyota Prius arrived around the same time, which was at 9:12 a.m. He stayed at the gym for about an hour and 20 minutes, pulling out of the parking lot at 10:38 a.m. As he leaves the parking lot, the same Toyota Prius begins to follow him as he drives toward Thomasville Road. Investigators believe this Prius followed Markel back to his home. At 11:02 a.m., the Tallahassee Police Department was called to Markel's residence, where he was found, quote, slumped over the driver's seat of his vehicle from an apparent gunshot to the head, according to the police report. The garage door to Markel's residence was still open, and according to court documents, Markel had been on a phone call in his car when he was interrupted by an unknown person in his driveway. He had been shot twice at intermediate range, once in the forehead and once in the left cheek. It was a neighbor that had heard the gunshots and called the police, and they claimed to see an unfamiliar Toyota Prius leaving Markel's driveway. Dan Markel survived the initial shooting. However, he died in the hospital the next day. At the time of the murder, law enforcement had very few leads, and it took a while for the investigation to really come together. On the 1-year anniversary of Markel's death, the Tallahassee Police Department held a press conference to ask the public if they had any information about that silver pine Toyota Prius that had been spotted following Markel from the gym and eventually leaving his driveway. But a Toyota Prius in the neighborhood doesn't tell us anything about motive. For that, investigators needed to dig a bit deeper into Markel's personal life, beyond just his career as an esteemed law professor. It turned out that the year before his death, Markel had gone through a relatively nasty divorce with his wife of nearly a decade, Wendi Adelson. When the couple married in 2006, Wendi had been a third-year law student at the University of Miami, and Dan had just joined the faculty at Florida State University Law School. The couple had met on a popular Jewish dating website at the time, known as JDate, and they hit it off. On the outside, their marriage looked like nothing short of a success. Their marriage had been announced in the New York Times, and in the coming years, they would go on to have 2 sons, one born in 2009 and the other in 2011. Both Wendi and Dan were working as law professors at FSU, and life seemed pretty good for the Markels. Friends, family, and even Wendi described Dan as a loving father, but it was also pretty clear that Wendi was struggling in Tallahassee. While she and Dan both had jobs at FSU, his was tenure track and hers was more of a contract position. And the northern Florida city of Tallahassee was far different from where she grew up in southern Florida. Wendi was having trouble figuring out if her career was going to continue to grow if she remained in Tallahassee. And in September of 2012, Dan came home from a business trip to discover that his wife and 2 sons, as well as most of his possessions, were nowhere to be found. Additionally, there were divorce papers on his bed. Wendi wanted a divorce, and she had packed up and taken the boys to live with her parents in Coral Springs, Florida. It was a custody proceeding that turned up the heat in the divorce proceedings. Both Wendi and Dan wanted custody of the children, and Dan argued that the boys shouldn't be allowed to leave Tallahassee. Wendi argued the boys would have more stability if they were allowed to stay with her family in South Florida. But in the immediate aftermath of the separation, court documents say that Wendi refused to tell Dan where she had taken their sons when she left their Tallahassee home. A judge refused Wendi's initial request to relocate, and over the next year, Wendi would continue to request that she and her children be able to relocate from Tallahassee, and every time she was refused. By the time their divorce was settled without trial in 2013, Wendi and Dan had agreed 50-50 shared custody of their children, and the couple had come to a mutual child support agreement. However, their time settling disagreements in court was far from over. In the coming months, they would find themselves in front of a judge to determine matters like arguments over money, the frequency in which Wendi would allow Dan to call their sons over Skype when they were not in his custody, and the children's education plans, as well as freedom of access to their children. In the months before his death, Dan had filed 2 motions with the court regarding Wendi and her family. The first had been in February of 2014 when Dan and his attorney filed a motion claiming that Wendi and her attorney had not been upfront about her financial assets at the time of the divorce. And then a month later, Dan filed a second motion, this time about his former mother-in-law, Donna Adelson. He requested that Donna Adelson not be allowed unsupervised access to his sons in order to protect them from, quote, disparaging comments about their father. A hearing was eventually scheduled to bring these complaints in front of a judge. However, Dan was murdered before the court date could be scheduled. Evidently, Dan did not have the best relationship with Wendi's family, especially in the wake of the divorce and the custody battle that kept rejecting Wendi's request to move her sons closer to her family in Coral Springs. Documents obtained by the court included email correspondence between Wendi and her mother Donna, who begged her daughter to coerce Markel into allowing her children to move. Additionally, Wendi's brother Charlie, who worked as a dentist with his father in Coral Springs, disliked Markel and did not get along with him, even when he and Wendi were still married. It was starting to feel like law enforcement was approaching the motive for Dan's murder. Frustration by Wendi's family over the heated custody battle felt like a logical lead to investigate, and as this aspect of the investigation unfolded, details of the plot to kill Dan Markel began to seem like something that could come out of a movie rather than real life. It was pretty obvious to investigators that the green, or I should say silver pine, Prius was somehow connected to Dan Markel's murder. Between the sighting of the car following Markel's vehicle when he arrived and departed the Premier Health Fitness Center, and the neighbor's sighting of the Prius leaving his driveway after they heard the gunshots that prompted them to call 911, the Prius was definitely a lead. But no one in Wendi's family drove a silver pine Toyota Prius. It took about 2 years, but the Tallahassee Police Department was able to connect the Prius to 2 men, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. Garcia was arrested on May 26th of 2016, and Rivera was added as a co-defendant in the case on June 2nd. He was already serving time in federal prison for charges related to gang activity. At the time of Garcia's arrest, police gave few details to the public, but they did make it known that they were approaching the investigation as a murder-for-hire plot. When the probable cause affidavit in the arrest was finally unsealed by a judge days later, it confirmed that the arrest was made based on investigators' belief that Garcia and Rivera, both of Miami, had rented the Prius to make the trip from Miami to Tallahassee and murder Dan Markel. They had a contract from the rental car company from July 15th to July 21st, and they believed that the pair started their trip north to Tallahassee at that time. The pair checked into hotels on both July 16th and July 17th, and the hotel on the 17th was the West Tennessee Street Motel in Tallahassee. Additionally, cell towers placed both men's phones near the Premier Health and Fitness Center while Markel was inside, which corroborated what investigators saw on the security footage. On the morning of the killing, they had trailed Markel on his errands until they could eventually execute the hit at his home. The same affidavit further outlined the investigators' theories for the murder-for-hire plot. It was known that Garcia and Rivera were completely unknown to Markel before his death, which led investigators to conclude that these two men were, quote, enlisted to carry out the murder on behalf of someone else. That someone else being Wendi Adelson's family, notably her mother Donna and her brother Charlie. At the time of the murders, Charlie was dating a woman named her name's kind of hard to pronounce. At the time of the murders, Charlie was dating a woman named Catherine Magbanawa, who coincidentally shared 2 children with Sigfredo Garcia. Investigators believe that Magbanawa was the coordinator between the Adelsons and the 2 hitmen. Records from Magbanawa's cell phone show that she made and received several calls from Donna and Charlie Adelson, as well as Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, leading up to the day of the murder. In fact, the first call Sigfredo Garcia made immediately after the murder was to Catherine Magbanawa. Magbanawa was arrested on October 1st, 2016, also on murder charges, and her first trial took place in 2019. Her first trial ended in a mistrial, and a second trial began on May 16th of 2022. In 11 days, the trial was over, and on May 22nd, 2022, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, as well as 2 additional 30-year sentences for conspiracy and solicitation of murder. As part of the agreement with investigators, she agreed to testify against Charlie Adelson, who was eventually arrested in April 2022 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. During his October 2023 trial, he was found guilty and is now serving a life sentence for his role in the murder-to-hire plot. Luis Rivera, who was already serving time in federal prison for gang-related charges, took a plea deal in the case in 2016. He pleaded guilty to a charge of murder and received a 19-year sentence to be served concurrently with the sentence he was currently serving. In his confession, he told investigators that Sigfredo Garcia had been the one to pull him into the murder of Dan Markel, and that Catherine Magbanawa was, quote, the woman in the middle doing everything. He said that he did not know the names of the people who had hired him and Garcia to do the killing, but it was because, quote, the lady wanted her 2 kids back, the lady being Wendi Adelson. Which goes back to the motive behind the plot as a way for the Adelsons to end the custody battle between Wendi and Dan Markel. Sigfredo Garcia went on trial in 2019 for his role in the murder of Dan Markel at the same time as Catherine Magbanawa, and while her trial ended in a mistrial, Garcia's ended in a verdict. On October 11th, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, and on the 15th, he was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for conspiracy. With 4 now in custody for the murder of Dan Markel, a 5th arrest was made in the case in November 2023. Less than a month after her son was sentenced to life in prison for his role in Dan Markel's murder, Donna Adelson was arrested at the Miami International Airport on a warrant from Leon County, Florida. Apparently while trying to flee on a one-way ticket to Vietnam, a country with no extradition treaty to the U.S. She was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. And while her trial was initially set to begin in 2024, proceedings were delayed when her attorney pulled out his representation of the case on the first day of jury selection. Now, her trial is set to begin on August 25th, 2025, which is the Monday after this episode airs. The murder of Dan Markel is a case that has perplexed the public from the time it happened. It has garnered its fair share of media attention from major news outlets like 48 Hours, Dateline, and Court TV, who have all covered the case over the last decade. It will be interesting to see how the upcoming trial of Donna Adelson will add this new layer to the case and give us a bit more understanding of the family's motives for such a sinister plot. I invite you to continue reading up on the case, and I know I will be right there with you watching the news coverage. Thank you all for listening to today's episode of Law and Disorder on the Precinct 444 network. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and you can find all of our previous episodes on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms. Law and Disorder episodes have yellow icons if you want to look for those specifically. We release our new episodes of Precinct 444 every other Wednesday, so there are plenty episodes for you to check out. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you back here at the Precinct.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.